Por favor, pasen a sentarse. Ya vamos a dar inicio a la conferencia.
Muy buenos días a todos. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a esta conferencia titulada The Moral Machine Experiment. Now I will be switching to English to present our special guest today. Today we are very honored to have with us Dr. Edmond Awad. Please welcome him. Big applause. Edmond Awad is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Uehiro Center for Practical Ethics and at the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities at University of Oxford. Concurrently, Edmond is a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics and the Institute of Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at the University of Exeter. In addition, Edmond is an associate research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development and a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. Formerly, Edmond was a postdoctoral associate at MIT Media Lab, and in 2016, Edmond led the design, development, and research of Moral Machine, a website that gathers human decisions on moral dilemmas faced by driverless cars. The website has been visited by over 10 million users who contributed their judgments on 100 million dilemmas. Another website that Edmond co-created called My Goodness collected judgments over 3 million charity dilemmas. Edmond's work appeared in major academic journals, included Nature, PNAS, and Nature Human Behavior, and it has been covered in major media outlets, including the Associated Press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Spiegel, Le Monde, and El País. Edmond has a bachelor's degree in informatics engineering from Tisrin University in Syria, a master's degree in computing and information science, and a PhD in interdisciplinary engineering from Khalifa University, and a master's degree in media arts and science from MIT. Edmond's research interests are in the areas of AI, ethics, computational social science, and multi-agent systems. So, without any preamble, please welcome Dr. Edmond Awad.
Thank you, Andres, for the kind introduction. Thank you for University of Ibero and Professor Alejandro and the organizing committee for this amazing event, for inviting me, and especially for Professor Jorge for coordinating and doing all the work for me to be able to come here and be with you. And thanks to all of you for being here. It's a Friday near the end of this event, probably office hours for some people. So thank you for being here. It's really so great to be here, and it's such an honor to be part of this celebration. Okay. So driverless cars are already being tested on the roads in different places, and they are being prepared to become a reality at some point in the future. A lot of research is being done in different institutions, including here at Ibero. Professor Eduardo showed me yesterday some interesting work. Now, these cars will become reality at some point, which is probably good, because once they are perfected, still they're not going to be perfect, but experts say that they will be minimizing 90% of the current crashes that are currently happening with human drivers. Now, some of you might doubt this number, but regardless, let's assume it's 90%. The remaining 10% might include cases of moral trade-offs that the car will have to do. Now, a very abstracted version of these moral trade-offs could be inspired by the trolley problem, which is a philosophical conundrum, and here's the modern version of it. I'm sure many of you have already heard of it now. So in this case, we have a driverless car running on the road, and brake fails, right? It's a hypothetical scenario. Now, there are 10 pedestrians in front of it. The car is about to kill them. The only way out of that is if it swerves into this one passerby. Question is, should it do that or not? In another version, the car would swerve into the barrier or the wall, and it will kill its own passenger. So should a self-driving car sacrifice its own passenger if that means it will save 10 pedestrians? Now, my collaborators have done a study about this question, and they found that actually most people approve of that. So many people would actually say, yes, the car should sacrifice its own passenger if that means saving 10 pedestrians. But there was a catch. When they asked them if they're willing to buy such self-sacrificing cars, people said they would not be willing to buy them, even though they thought everyone else should do that. Now, of course, this is a classic social dilemma where there is something that everyone knows is the right thing to do, but nobody has incentive to do it, and nobody wants to do it because other people probably won't do it. But before we're getting there, I'm sure some of you might be wondering, are these situations actually plausible? Is it possible that these situations, that the driverless cars will actually face a case where it will either sacrifice one group or another? In fact, many might say, well, I drive and I never faced these situations, right? And I haven't heard about any other person who have faced these trolley problem situations. So is it really worth thinking about them? And this could be true. It's possible that, yes, we don't really face this trolley problem dilemma in our daily life, but we do face moral trade-offs in our daily life. To give you an example, maybe when you go to buy a car, you can have a choice of buying an SUV, a big car, or you could buy a sedan car. Now, an SUV will give you more protection, but maybe at the cost of other people on the road. Now, this could be fine because you have children and you have babies and you really want to give them more protection, right? But it's a decision that has a moral consequences. Now, also when you're driving on the road, let's look at this scenario. Let's say you're driving this white car in the middle, and you have a big truck on your right, a cyclist on your left. Now, you could be driving exactly in the middle of the lane, but maybe you're very conscious about this big truck, so you drive closer to the cyclist. In this case, you're putting more risk on the cyclist, right? Or maybe you're really very conscious about the cyclist, so you end up driving closer to the truck, which means putting more risk on yourself. So in either way, you're kind of basically shifting risk between the different road users, including yourself. Now, maybe if we ask you, what do you think you would do in these situations? You might say, look, I'm an altruist. I will always try to give more berth for these cyclists. I will try to sacrifice myself to help others. But when you're driving in that situation, probably things will change. Spur of the moment, things are different. But now, with driverless cars, these situations will be pre-programmed. And cars don't get nervous. Machines will not get nervous, right? But also, the same algorithm will be implemented in hundreds of thousands of cars, which would be driving like many miles. So let's imagine now we have two companies. One company that have a software that would actually, in these situations, will drive closer to the big truck. And, sorry, I should have jumped to the next slide. So let's say this is one instance. You drive, the software drive closer to the big truck, and after 1 million instances, let's say those risks materialize in some fatalities. Let's say here, because you're driving, the car is driving itself closer to the truck, after all these situations, this materialized in 5 fatalities of passengers. But in another company, maybe the car in this case will give more berth away from the track closer to the cyclist, and maybe this will result with one cyclist. Now we're back into the same trolley problem situation, but at the statistical level, right? It's at the group and aggregate level. So in a way, there are some trade-offs, right? And this is actually where the discussion is supposed to be. It's not a discussion about whether the car should kill the grandma or the baby. It's a discussion about how are those machines shifting the distribution of risk and safety among road users, and whether any of this shifting is acceptable or not. Now, of course, when it comes to these kind of questions, we believe that, of course, experts, domain experts, maybe ethicists, and maybe car engineers, maybe people who have expertise in these domains, should weigh on this question as well, should probably be mainly weighing on these questions. But at the same time, the public input is also important here, especially with the emotional salience of crashes that have been happening with automated vehicles. So for that purpose, we decided we're going to build this website, which we called the Moral Machine. And of course, when you put a website and you try to aim for getting as many people as possible, you have to really dump down, simplify, abstract, and put things as simple as possible. There's no place for nuance when you put things on the internet and people have a very short attention span, right? So this is why you're going to see these scenarios that are more similar to the trolley problem. So this is sort of an interface. If you come to the website, maybe some of you have, you will see something like this. It's a scenario that includes a driverless car headed on the road. Sometimes it has passengers, sometimes it doesn't. But in every situation, brake failed. And the car is faced with a decision. Either it's going to kill these 4 pedestrians who are crossing illegally. As you can see here, they are jaywalking, including the dog. Or it could swerve into the barrier and sacrifice its passenger. What should the car do? As a user on the website, you would click and I say, I think the car should swerve into the barrier and sacrifice the passenger, or I think the car should continue on and kill those 4 pedestrians, including the dog. Now, usually you would see 13 variations of these scenarios, and as a gamification aspect, we try to give you back some feedback about our summary of how you answered your questions. For example, what was your most saved character, most killed characters, or maybe something about when it comes to saving more lives, like where do you stand, and where do you stand compared to other people. Now that I presented this to you, I want to try this here with you. So I'm going to ask you kindly to participate. Of course, if you don't want to, that's also fine. And raising hands, we have 2 options again here, this situation. The car is empty, it doesn't have passengers, because it's going to pick up someone. But as in every story, the brake fails, and the car is going to either continue straight, kill this little boy, or it could swerve and kill this little man, okay? So, niño versus hombre. That's about the Spanish that I can speak in this presentation. So, raise your hand if you think the car should continue ahead and sacrifice the little boy. I have 2, 3 hands. Okay, a couple of hands. Raise your hand if you think the car should swerve and sacrifice the adult male, if it has to choose between these 2. Okay, so I see that a lot of people, a lot of you have some sort of a sympathy or a preference to save the boy over the adult. This is not very different. I mean, I would say maybe the majority here is more majority than what we found in our data, that, for example, more people, 75% of people, would prefer that the car swerve in this situation and sacrifice the adult male. Okay. Can we do another one? You have now, again, the car could continue straight, brake fails, there's no way out of this, except that either sacrificing the man who is crossing legally, or swerving into this athletic male who is crossing illegally. How many of you think the car should continue straight, sacrifice the adult male who is crossing legally? Raise your hand. Very few. And how many of you think the car should swerve, sacrifice the male athlete who is crossing illegally? Okay. Again, a majority of you. That is also similar. Again, this is also what we found, and it's very likely that many of you basically think about this crossing legally versus illegally. I don't think many of you are thinking about, oh, this annoyingly athletic person is crossing the street, I'm going to get rid of them. It's more about probably because they are crossing illegally. Okay, if you can entertain me with one last one. This time, it's not one athlete, it's two males who are crossing illegally. So you could, the car, raise your hand if you think the car should continue straight and sacrifice the one man who's crossing legally. Okay? And raise your hand if you think the car should swerve, sacrifice the two men who are crossing illegally. Okay, there's still majority for swerving, but it's closer to 50-50 now. This is a little bit different from the data that we find. Now, I want to apologize for putting you through this exercise. I realize it's not an easy thing to do. And these are really hard dilemmas and things to go through. So even though that we have gamified it, and maybe it might seem with the characters, like it seems like a toy, and like a, it is actually, you know, it's kind of quite brutal questions to think about. I'll talk a little bit now about just behind the scenes of how we designed this website. Part of trying to make it as realistic or trying to capture different aspects, and also for generalizability of our data, we try to consider different kind of characters, like adult males and females, elderly, young, some professions like medical or business, athletes, a criminal, baby, dog, and cat. And we built up those scenarios basically to combine multiple components. One component here is whether the car is staying or swerving. This is in moral philosophy. There is something called about, I'm just now blanking on it, basically. But there's kind of there is a kind of a preference for omission, right? That, you know, you should always, you know, leaving the car, not doing anything, leaving the car do its course is better than intervening, because the moment you intervene, you have become part of that, right? So we want to test that part. It's like an omission bias. There's also pedestrians versus passengers. Also, there is a debate over like pedestrians who are, you know, people who did not buy into the system, so they are like externalities. Maybe I don't want to be part of this whole driverless car situation, so why should the car sacrifice me, right? But passengers, they do, so they should. On the other hand, some people would say, but if you buy a driverless car or you pay for that service, then the car should be entitled to help you. So there's some kind of arguments on both sides. There's also aspect of illegality, whether they're crossing legally or illegally, and then there are some other characteristics about characters, like in this case, elderly versus young. So basically, we had these factors. We talked about this: gender, age, fitness, social status, species, and number of characters. Now, I want to be clear here. We've included all these factors not because we think that they should matter, but because we think that they do matter to a lot of people, right? We know from literature and research in psychology that these factors do sway people in their answers. So we wanted to capture these biases. We also translated this website to 9 other languages, very painful task. And we had in the first 18 months about 4 million users who contributed to 40 million dilemmas like the one you saw. Now, today, we have reached about over 100 million decisions by over 10 million users, but the analysis that you will see is for these 4 million users. There's also an optional demographic survey at the end, which we ask people. It's a little bit more work, so we still have 500,000 people who filled those surveys. We're grateful. Now, people came from different places around the world. Now, this is to show you, like, there's one point for at least one person in every place. And just for comparison, this is a map of lit world. So the places where there is light. Okay. So this is just to show, for example, in places in Australia, maybe there are people who live more near the coast. So that's probably why we don't get in the middle. But it also points to something very important, is that as you can see, there are big places in Africa that are missing, because maybe there are many of these places do not have access to electricity. So of course, point stands that our participants are biased because we cannot reach out to everyone. People who don't have access to internet or electricity will not be able to reach their website, and of course we will not basically have their data. So please keep that in mind as we talk about the results. Now, the results were published in 2018. I'm going to now, probably some of you may have seen those results, but I'm going to now get through them and then talk about some implication. Now, let me explain this figure. It's a little bit, has some, a lot of things. So the x-axis here at the bottom, you see this is a delta PR. This is not a physics formula. It's just simply a difference between two probabilities. What are these two probabilities? It's the probability of saving whoever is on the right-hand side, which in this case is sparing humans, minus the probability of sparing those who are on the left side, sparing pets. Which this means that if I take all the scenarios that I have that have included humans, and I see how often people did not click to kill them, as in like they spared them, then that is the probability, right? And then I do the same for pets. And then I subtract these two numbers, and I get, in this case, almost 0.6, which means kind of people spared humans much more than they spared pets. Makes sense, probably not very controversial, but maybe for some it is. We can do the same thing for another factor, which is the number of lives. In this case, each time you include one more life in the situation, this is how much the probability of sparing them increases. So if I had one person, and now I replace them with two, or add another person, then the probability increases by something less than 0.4. If I add 4, then it even overwhelms the difference between sparing humans and pets. And then we can do the same for all the other factors, and we can also compare these factors. So now we can see here which factors people think are the most important or most relevant for making these decisions. At the bottom you see here, sparing humans over pets is probably the strongest. Sparing more lives over fewer lives is the second. Also could be not as controversial for many. And then sparing the young over sparing the elderly is the third strongest. Now these are three that are, you can see here, they are closer to each other. The next two ones are sparing the lawful over the unlawful, and then sparing higher status over lower status. Now there are other things like sparing the fit, sparing the females over males, sparing pedestrians. These are weaker, to weaker degree. Now, sparing the young over the elderly is it's an interesting thing, because you might find sparing humans over pets and sparing more lives over fewer lives less controversial, right? And sparing the young over the elderly seems quite discriminatory. And in in many countries, it is considered illegal to discriminate based on age. Though some people say in some medical domains, there are situations where it is okay to give a priority to younger patients over older patients. Also, some people might say, well, everybody gets the chance to be young before they get old, so it's kind of, in a way, it's not completely discriminating. So there are many arguments in this situation. But it's an interesting case, and we wanted really to know, is this really driven by one specific character? Now remember, we considered 20 different characters. So we try to do the same thing with each character now, but now taking as a baseline the adult male and adult female, which are it's a more neutral character. So what I'm going to do is the probability of sparing the adult male and female, which means I take all the scenarios, they exist, and calculate how often people spare them. And then I will go to every other character and calculate probability of being spared and subtract that from male and female. For example, the baby stroller here, people want to spare the baby stroller much more than they did for adult male and female. We can, we can do the same thing for other characters and we also compare them. You can look at the top 4 characters. You can see they're all characters that include younger lives. So the preference to spare younger lives is not just totally driven by one special character. It's actually something that people find, basically feel maybe more like strongly about. Now, even looking at the bottom, aside from the dog and the cat and the criminal in between, there's also elderly man, elderly woman, also are bottom on the list. So again, there is some sort of something about, it's a very tough figure. It's really hard to talk about, and it feels like it's kind of, we are horrible people for even ranking or doing any discrimination in this case. But this is actually what we captured in our data. Now let's talk about cross-country. I mentioned that we had, I'm going to talk about the implication in a second. I mentioned that we had people coming from different places in the world. In fact, we had almost from every country and territory. But for the next analysis, we limited the analysis to only countries we had at least 100 participants from, just for robustness. So what we do is we can calculate those 9 numbers for each country. And then we have, let's say, a 9-dimensional vector, or vector with 9 elements for each country. We can use that to calculate distance between every pair of countries. And then we use this distance using some machine learning clustering algorithms. In this case, it's a hierarchical clustering, which means it shows us a little bit more than just clusters. Let's see how it looks like. This is visualized in this dendrogram. There's a lot on this. We're going to break it down a little bit now. But basically, we have 3 colors on the branches, which are the 3 main clusters. Now, you could zoom in also on the names of the countries, and we will talk about Mexico in a second. The colors of those countries are colored after some classification that was proposed by true anthropologists, which classifies countries into one of 10 categories. Of course, one of the categories is other, which they could not probably, did not have enough data to classify. But the categories, they might seem weird as well, because they have South Asia, Protestant, which I suppose means Protestant majority, Orthodox, Latin America, Islamic, English-speaking, Confucian, Catholic, Baltic. Let's see how those 3 groups. First cluster, we call it Western because it has many Western countries. It has English-speaking, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox majority country. The second cluster has many Islamic, South Asian, and Confucian countries. We call it Eastern. Of course, it's a bit reductionist, but let's just call it Eastern for ease of reference. And then the last cluster, we called it Southern, but it actually has 2 subclusters. One of them is almost like exclusively Latin American countries. And you can notice here Mexico, and you can see that Costa Rica, as it seems, is the closest in terms of their moral preferences in our data. The other subcluster seems like a former French colonies. Seems like, and in fact, France is part of that as well. Now, we can do more than that. So now we can try to see how each of these 3 clusters differs from each other, okay? Now, this is a radar plot, and in this case, we're showing z-scores. Z-scores means z equals 0 means average, okay? You will see that Western cluster is not very interesting because it has a lot of countries, so in a way, it has been closer to the average. But let's see the Eastern cluster. Now, just to clarify here, again, z equals 0 is average, so minus negative values does not mean that people have the opposite preference. So there are things like sparing the young. This is almost something that we found almost universal in every country. Almost in every country, people prefer to spare the young over the elderly. But this difference would vary between countries. And in this Eastern cluster, it is less pronounced in the Eastern cluster, which also is consistent with some work in culture and anthropology about how people in the Eastern cultures have a higher respect to their elderly, and they have a stronger family values, and they have kind of also like attention to spirituality, which also like elderly hold a lot of this spiritual wisdom. Other things, you could see that, for example, sparing pedestrians is stronger. Sparing humans over pets is stronger. Maybe people in the Eastern world do not care as much about pets as in the Western cluster. And then in the Southern cluster, we can also see other things like sparing females is much stronger in this cluster. I don't really have any explanation for that. It seems like it could be driven by the France and the French colonies, which are a bit different from the rest of European countries. Now, we can also do more. We can investigate a little bit more. We can try to see what factors could actually predict these cross-country differences. Now, one of the very famous measures in cross-country studies is something called individualism, collectivism. And this measure basically it's also not perfect, but it puts countries on a spectrum. That some countries are very individualist. They focus on the individual. Like each person think of themselves as, independent, strong, have an agency. They have strong institutions. People have a pro-sociality to strangers. On the other end, you have collectivist society. People have a strong family values, have a strong ties to their extended family members. Their loyalty is not to the state, but more to their extended family members. They seek their family members for protection and for help and for anything. So their loyalty is higher for their extended family members than for strangers. Now, because in individualist societies, it's an egalitarian society which says that everyone should be treated very equally, in this case, saving more lives is more important than saving fewer lives, unlike with collectivist societies where other factors could play in. Another factor also, rule of law. So rule of law means how strongly respected the law in a country. Some countries, maybe like in Japan and Germany, the law is very well respected. People abide by it, feel that it's outrageous that other people would violate it. In other countries, the law is still have its own respect, but people sometimes feel like it's okay to violate it from time to time, right? These are places like in the Middle East where I come from. It's kind of like okay for people to violate the law every now and then. Again, we see here some correlation between sparing the lawful and rule of law. So countries in Japan and Germany, let's say, people find it that, well, if the dilemma came about because somebody was jaywalking, then maybe it is more acceptable that the car sacrifice them. But in other countries where violating the law is something not a big deal, people find it outrageous that it's an outrageous punishment if I just jaywalk, that the car should just go and sacrifice me first. Okay, now let's talk about implications. A very important note to make, and please keep in mind, is that in moral philosophy, there is a distinction between normative ethics and descriptive ethics. Normative ethics basically talks about what we should do. It's the right thing to do, right? This is something that's usually pursued by philosophers and legal scholars. Descriptive ethics is what most people think we should do, or what most people do, actually, or what our cultures and norms and values tell us to do, which might not be always the right thing to do. Right? Now, why is this distinction is important? Because this research falls under descriptive ethics. So what that means is the fact that a lot of people think you should sacrifice the older people to save younger people does not mean that this should be implemented, right? So we talked about descriptive ethics, about our data. What about normative ethics? You might wonder, okay, so this is what people think. What is the right thing to do? Now, answering this question is very hard, and there is no single right answer to that. But there are multiple acceptable, ethically defensible answers. And Germany, in fact, in 2016 was probably the first country who decided to put a task to answer this question. So they brought a group of ethicists, or not just ethicists, actually experts, and this is just their credentials. You have people in law, ethics, engineering, consumer protection. They have a Catholic bishop. They have a former public prosecutor. So they brought these different experts, and they sat together for months and months and came up with a set of rules. Let's now compare what we find from the public with what these experts have found. The first thing we find, if you remember, that the strongest thing that people feel about is human over pets. In this case, the committee actually said something that does not disagree with this. They did say the system should be programmed to accept damage to animals or objects if that means saving humans, right? So it seems like all good here between the descriptive and the normative. Second is more over fewer. Now, here there was some debate because some of you will realize that there is something called utilitarianism, which is a school in philosophy that says you should try to do the best, maximize the happiness of the most people, right? And in this case, they would be like, you should try to minimize loss of life. So some members of the committee were basically proponent of this, so they put this statement like that. But other members were not happy about it because they were deontologists, which says that you should not be trading lives. So they had to put another statement to say, but you should not be trading life. So in a way, they end up having a little bit of a contradiction in their results, but at least we could say some of them agrees with the public. Young over elderly. That was in clear disagreement with the committee who said that there should be no discrimination based on any of the physical feature. Next, lawful over unlawful. Here, there is also maybe not disagreement in some interpretation. So the committee said, look, if this whole dilemma came about because somebody was violating the law, then look at the language that is used. The parties that are involved in the generation of the risk should not sacrifice the non-involved parties. So in a way, the rule says, well, if somebody is following the law, they should not be sacrificed. But what about the person who is violating the law? Well, we don't want to say anything about that, right? So it's a little bit abstract and a little bit maybe non-committal, maybe for a reason, because they didn't want to be also controversial. Finally, higher status over lower status. This was clearly in disagreement with what the committee said. Now, the other implication I want to talk about is in terms of the cross-country analysis. Now, as we said here, we had found some differences among countries. Now, let's imagine, okay, so it seems like this is probably almost done. Let's imagine we have a company that have a sum that is running cars on the roads. And they have some level of harm that is maybe similar for both who are legally crossing or illegally crossing. Let's say now this company managed to find a software update that they could do to their car that will make their car less harmful, but only if everyone is crossing legally, right? If somebody is crossing illegally, they're gonna be under more risk. Now, the question is here, should this company implement this update or not? In some countries where rule of law is strong, maybe people will find that these companies not only they are allowed to do the update, but they might even say that they are morally obligated to implement this update because they have a way to minimize harm, right? But in other countries, they might find that outrageous and might say the companies should not now change the rules to make a software that will actually differentiate based on people violating or crossing the rule. Are we okay on time? 5 minutes? Okay, I'm going to be just closing down with this. 2 other studies. I had more, but I guess I spoke maybe more slowly than I anticipated. And that would be it. So I just want to talk about these 2 projects which were related to moral machine. And they're both related to creating a prototype or a proof of concept for how can you implement ethical decision making in machines. Now, of course, there are many different AI techniques. And in this case, we just chose 2 just to showcase the possibilities. So in this work, it was collaboration with many authors. Basically, we built this computational model using a Bayesian approach, or Bayesian framework. So in this case, we assume that people have answered some scenarios. And now we break down those scenarios into their smaller elements. For example, for every character now we have this long vector. We have a character, whether the character 0 and 1, whether the character exists or not exist in that scenario. We also do some dimensionality reduction into a smaller thing. Like, for example, if people care about pregnant women, they probably also care about children. So we kind of try to minimize that into a smaller vector. But then we build this utility function, which basically calculates two things. One of them is the weight of each of these factors, because each person have a different weight. Maybe you care more about this factor than of the other factor. And F here is whether this factor exists or not. Now, how do we know the weight of each factor for each person? This is a latent variable, as you can say. It's something that we don't know about. But we're going to use basically the few scenarios that people answered to reverse engineer that number or that variable, and then use that to calculate the utility that for each person in this scenario. So for example, if I give you a new scenario now, I know how much you weigh the different factors, and now I know whether these factors exist or not, how much you value this outcome, how much you value this outcome, and then subtract them and say, this person would have chosen this or that. So this is an example. And then, clicker is not working. This another example is a different case. Now we assume people have also answered some of the scenarios, but we also try to model from the answers of other people how they would have answered the other scenarios. So also we assume here now we have a group of people who have answered some of these scenarios, and then we try to figure out what would be the answers for the next ones, and then we use an aggregation function that would produce a collective decision maker for this group of people. Now, again, this is also a proof of concept. We don't think that this is how you should program driverless cars, because people are usually misinformed or don't have enough knowledge or maybe have not thought enough about these issues. But you can think about situations where if the experts have sanctioned some of these factors, maybe there are situations where the experts also disagree about, which is something common in moral philosophy, and maybe you just need a tiebreaker. In that case, you could use the public as someone who could just choose between different groups of experts. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your patience and for your listening.
Thank you very much, Edmond. It was, without any doubt, very interesting and something we may think about, because this is something that it's very close to our lives. So now maybe we have time for a couple of questions, if someone wants to ask something to Edmond.
Thank you. I found the study fascinating, and I have a question that might be very simple, but based on the results of the different regions, would you conclude that the autonomous cars should be programmed differently based on the characteristics of each region, or should there be just one set of programming? And the reason for that is because, well, at least in my view, I believe there is one set of universal rules for living together. You know, one set of moral rules that should apply to every part of the world, one set of emotional rules. So how would that impact the result of autonomous cars being in the street?
Yes, that's a very difficult question, but it's also the right question to ask as well, because yes, what do we learn from this? I guess what I was trying to say is that, look, there are some universalities. Like, people do prefer young over elderly, do prefer to save this over that. So even if we try to see the public reaction to these things, we might still see that maybe, you know, there are some similarities here and there. But also we found these differences, and we don't know how big those differences are. Are they big enough to ask for change of rules between different countries? Now, I would probably disagree with you a little bit about whether we have universal rules or not. I think maybe there are some, within some limit, there are the universalities, but maybe there are some differences as well. And also, aside from that discussion, I do think that, you know, we already have different traffic rules in different countries, right? And, you know, in England and some Commonwealth countries, people drive on the wrong side of the road, right? And in some places, there is no speed limit, like in Germany, there are some. So what would prevent, you know, having some differences in these cases, right? And for example, McDonald's, when they open in some Islamic countries, they don't serve pork food. So even like these, you know, let's say countries and businesses, they realize that they have to adapt to the market. And in this case, it's probably a little bit more, I mean, the question about, for example, the pork, for example, could have some moral connotation as well, right? So it is likely that, you know, we should expect that different rules exist. But maybe the bigger problem is that right now, most of these commissions on ethics comes out of the Western world, right? You have the European Commission, you have commission coming in the US, in the Latin America. Like, you don't have a lot of commissions coming outside from the Western world. And when people talk about the deployment of driverless cars on a larger scale, a lot of people anticipate that it will be in China, Singapore, or the Emirates, which are places that have different values from these Western values. So of course, in these cases, you know, these countries probably should not be just copying or adapting or reusing, like basically using these exact same, let's say, rules or policies that are out there. They probably will take this into consideration in what is consistent with their values.
No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta.
Hello. Yeah, what I wanted to ask you is, as you mentioned at the beginning of the conference, most of us haven't been actually in these kind of situations. So most of the ideas that we have around what we would do, we haven't actually done them. So do you believe that, as in game theory, after repeating, and I'm not saying that you should actually go and crash against someone, but after repetition of these scenarios, the actual results of the surveys would change, and maybe we would actually find something different as to what we believe we should do?
Yes, and I think you've touched on two different things together. One of them is stated preferences, what people say they prefer, and revealed preferences, what they actually do, right? And then you also mentioned about the dynamic, the multi-agent setting situation where we actually interact with them, right? So on the first one, look, yes, stated preferences, revealed preferences could differ in many situations. They might differ in this case, and you might be inclined to say, well, we want to capture what people actually do rather than what they think they would do, right? I think in this context, we probably wanted to capture what people think they would do. We don't want to capture what people actually, how people are actually driving, or how they would actually sacrifice. Because we have like some kind of implication about how the public's reaction is going to be about these cars when they realize they are probably implemented with some bias one way or another. So let's say maybe now you're sitting in your, at your balcony and reading the newspaper about that there's some statistics now, driverless cars are actually systematically sacrificing children, right? This probably you might feel outraged. Maybe a lot of people might feel the same thing about that, right? You might find that this company maybe should be questioned. There should be some, right? Maybe a similar thing could happen if you hear that it systematically sacrifice cyclists, or maybe you might feel less strongly about that, right? So we're trying to capture also in a way how would people feel about these things rather than how they actually do themselves. Now, the dynamics aspect, yes, now we're talking about, again, you have to really remember that this is a very abstracted version. We're talking about 100% these things will happen, but in reality, also cars don't really know if this will happen 100%, right? So, of course, probably a better study would try to capture this aspect by trying to say, well, we know it might do that. It might, but in the case of a website where you're trying to reach as many different countries as possible, you want to try to simplify it, right? But doing studies in that domain would make sense. And also trying to see, okay, now that we have more cars, maybe the adoption, I mean, there's already the attitude of adoption of driverless cars is probably changing, right? Maybe our attitudes as well about who is to blame, who is responsible, is probably also changing over time. So things will probably change over time, right? And as we drive next to them, they might also influence our behavior, and maybe we will influence their behavior. So all of these are possibilities. So take this as a screenshot or snapshot of this data at this time, and who knows what could happen after.
Yeah, there's another.
Thank you. My question goes in general about artificial intelligence. It's about if people should be informed beforehand that there's an interaction with AI at some point. For example, Google made this presentation where there's a fake call from an AI to a person to make a reservation. But that person was not informed that it was an AI, and he was fooled. Here I see something similar. Why don't have special lanes for AI cars or automatic cars, or have a separate world or an adapted city for this kind of tools where you can reduce the risk, not to zero, but a lot, so people can be informed that they are interacting with this kind of tools or systems that sometimes might have to make these decisions, but it's up to the people if they want to risk themselves to cross that lane where an automatic car is coming. So what do you think about that?
Yes, and I think driverless cars currently are designed in a way that makes them very clear that they are driverless cars, not regular cars. But the question whether there should be a separate lanes and separate, I mean, that is also a plausible idea, right? Like maybe some people will have to build a whole ecosystem that will accommodate these new situations we are in. And maybe some places in some, I don't know, like some parts of cities or some, they might actually do that. And it might be for the better or not, right? So it is a possibility. Now, how these cars are making decisions and how is the risk being distributed by these cars, that is also should be more transparent. It's not an easy question to answer, right? And some people might say, well, why can't the car be random? Why just don't they, like, if they face any trade-off, let's just, it doesn't matter if it's a boy or like a child or like an elderly person, the car should just make the decision randomly. But this is also a very simplistic suggestion because random, or like say, if you're trying to say distribution of risk is different from distribution of harm, right? some road users are more vulnerable than others. And some road users are probably more available on the roads than others. So if, let's say, 80% of the road users are, let's say, passengers, and then if the car is acting, let's say, uniformly, randomly, then we will probably end up with 80% of the crashes involving passengers. So is this fair? Maybe. Or maybe people would think about 50-50, right? So what is really the right thing to do here? Or if, should people wearing helmets have now higher chance of survival? Does that mean the cars should maybe go to target them because they have a higher chance of surviving? It's kind of, in a way, you're penalizing people who are following the law, right? So it's a tough thing to do, but I think it is important to get at this question and ask, how is the risk being redistributed by these machines? And this question actually is kind of echoes in all other AI applications, right? Even if they are being prepared to be used in other applications like in medicine or judicial systems, then there is also a question about, even if they are perfected, even if they're doing much better than an average doctor or average judge, there is also a question of, are they changing this distribution? They're very likely they are actually increasing inequality, right? People who are discriminated against are probably be discriminated against more, right? Because because we have the same algorithms being implemented in multiple different locations, it might actually have a multiplicative effect. So that is, where the question, yeah. But yes, transparency is important in this case.
Muy bien. Una última pregunta.
Thank you. Well, I had a question, and we were talking about the ethical possibilities, the ethical implications, but I was thinking, how will this be regulated? Because how will be the legal liability, on who will be fall the legal liability? Like, someone has to program this machine. So if this machine kills someone, who will be the fault? The car's fault, the passenger's fault, the pedestrian's fault, or the programmer's fault? So I think that's something that hasn't been talked about a lot. And I think that it should be also a pressing matter because this should be regulated. And really, who takes the fault in these cases?
I'm very glad you asked this question. We had some studies before where we tried, and part of it also came into reality. So what you're talking about is actually happened, and they had its own implication even in August. So many of you probably remember the crash that happened in Tempe, Arizona, which involved, was it Uber? There's the car, and it has a person inside the car, and there was a passenger crossing by carrying a bike. The car took a long time to detect that it was a person. It detected an object, but it didn't detect that it was a person. And the person in the car, they were shown in a video that were sort of distracted, but then they said also they were looking at the screen of instructions. It seems like both the human and the machine missed that person. The person was killed. And there was a whole case in the case for years, right? And it was recently resolved by incriminating the person in the car. And we have seen that in our studies when we were running, we asked people about these situations. We tell them, okay, here's a case. There's a person who is the primary driver of the car, and there is a machine software that could override them. And they both failed to do anything. Person died. Who do you blame more? How much responsibility do you put on this group? People blame the human. Said, okay, maybe because they are the primary driver. And then we showed the opposite. Okay, now you have a model, level 4. The car drives itself, but it has a safety driver, a human safety driver. The car did not detect the person. The person inside the car did not also do anything. They killed the person. Who do you blame more? How do you blame the human? How do you blame the car? People also blame the human more. And there are some anecdotal cases in the media about also how the driver was distracted. In one case, they were maybe watching Harry Potter on the screen, or another case, they were watching something else. So there is some kind of tendency that also, despite people feeling aware and conscious about this technology, there is some tendency for blaming the humans. So that also puts an important question on what is the role of regulation here? And if they were being done using something like tort laws or jury duties, then from what we find, it might actually end up being that actually even the juries would end up incriminating the human more. So it remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all your questions. Now, Dr. Alejandro Anaya, Vice Chancellor of the University, will be giving a present to Edmond for his participation.
Muy bien. Bueno, hemos llegado al momento de clausura de este gran evento que duró 3 días de mucho aprendizaje y reflexiones. Y pues para mí y para todo el equipo organizador ha sido un placer y un gusto estar entre gente tan talentosa que ha aportado en gran medida sus enseñanzas. Entonces ahora es el turno del doctor Alejandro Anaya, vicerrector de la Ibero, de dar unas palabras de clausura de este evento. Adelante.
Sí, muchas gracias, Jorge, y gracias a ustedes por quedarse aquí 2 minutitos más. Todavía tenemos el último taller, pero pues aprovechando que tenemos el público cautivo para cerrar el evento, pues les voy a robar 2 minutos. Han sido 3 días fantásticos en los que muchos de ustedes lo habrán como que pasado por muchas de las conferencias, pero quienes no estuvieron en todas las conferencias están en el YouTube, véanlas, no tiene desperdicio verdaderamente ninguna de ellas. Empezamos con este viaje fantástico por el mundo del diseño y la arquitectura utilizando la inteligencia artificial. Después pasamos a las reflexiones jurídicas, sobre todo sobre la propiedad, quién es el dueño o la dueña de los productos que se generan mediante la inteligencia artificial. Entonces fue una discusión muy técnica, jurídica, sobre estos temas de propiedad intelectual. Después tuvimos una reflexión muy aguda sobre el tema del uso de la inteligencia artificial en la educación, que además fue una postura muy crítica que señaló, que puso el dedo en la llaga alrededor de los temas que tenemos que tener en el radar si es que vamos a estar utilizando cada vez más y más la inteligencia artificial. Entonces fue una conjugación entre lo educativo y lo ético. Y después tuvimos una presentación exclusivamente centrada en las discusiones éticas alrededor de toda esta agenda del uso de la inteligencia artificial y su avance acelerado. Posteriormente, hoy en la mañana, quienes estuvieron acá, pues este también fascinante mundo de cómo va avanzando la robótica conjugada con la inteligencia artificial y pues a lo que nos vamos a estar enfrentando quizá dentro de poco en este sentido. Y concluimos con esta reflexión sobre las máquinas morales. Entonces les invito a revisar los videos, van a estar ahí todos en el YouTube de todas estas conferencias y por supuesto en el Inter, talleres y talleres y talleres y talleres. Tanto con nuestros conferencistas como con la facultad de la Ibero, con las y los colegas de la Ibero que están metidos en estos temas, que están metidas en esta agenda y que estuvieron trabajando con el estudiantado y con pues, el público en general interesado, aterrizando los temas que se fueron abordando en las conferencias. Entonces creo que ha sido una experiencia fantástica. Nos quedamos en la Ibero con mucha tarea, ¿no? Con mucha tarea de seguir avanzando en esta agenda, tanto desde la perspectiva de la formación, es decir, de los programas que ofrecemos, como desde la perspectiva de la investigación. Así que pues nos quedamos con todo ese material tan rico sobre la mesa y tenemos que aprovecharlo para seguir dando pasos hacia adelante en esa dirección para que la Ibero sea un centro de impulso del trabajo académico responsable y éticamente consciente y por supuesto, como siempre, con la mira que tiene la Ibero en el humanismo o en sus valores y sus ideales, pero tenemos que ser un centro donde avancemos y donde tengamos una actividad muy intensa alrededor de esta agenda para el beneficio, por supuesto, de nuestro estudiantado y en general de la sociedad. Así que, pues bueno, no me resta más que voy a volver a agradecer otra vez a todas las personas involucradas en este evento, porque fueron muchas semanas, muchos meses de trabajo y ahora 3 días así súper intensos. Entonces, voy a empezar por Jorge, Alberto, el doctor Jorge González, la doctora Araceli Ortega y el doctor Alberto Soto. Profesores, por favor, levántense, profesores de la Ibero.
Gracias.
Que fueron, pues no solo el motorcito intelectual, sino también el motorcito logístico detrás de todo este evento, por supuesto con el acompañamiento de las directoras y el director divisional. Aquí veo a la doctora Graciela Teruel, al doctor Gamaliel Hernández y no sé si la doctora Alfonso acá está también. Muchas gracias por todo el empuje. Otro aplauso. A la maestra Manola Martín, que ha estado encabezando todos los eventos de 80 años de la Ibero y que estuvo totalmente al pendiente, impulsando, acompañándonos todo eso. Al equipo de la Vicerrectoría Académica, Chantal Zamudio, Leti González, que yo creo que están en la oficina, Emma está allá atrás, Dani y Gina, pues ya no se ven, pero y por supuesto Leti, que no están aquí, pero que están ahorita seguramente resolviendo algún asunto, algún pendiente final. A todos los colegas que hicieron sus talleres, que participaron en los talleres, también, como decía, profesores y profesoras de la Ibero, que fueron un montón, muchísimas gracias. A las y los estudiantes que nos estuvieron apoyando también con todos los temas de la logística, no sé si hay algunos aquí adentro del auditorio o están allá afuera, pero sin el apoyo del estudiantado no hubiera sido posible. Y el empuje de los departamentos y toda la comunidad universitaria, y gracias por recordarme, por supuesto, el equipo de las divisiones y sobre todo los AFCAS de las 3 divisiones, las asistentes ejecutivas de las divisiones, que sé que también estuvieron ahí metiendo el hombro. O sea, fue un trabajo colectivo de un equipo grandísimo que, que hay que reconocer y aceptar, y por supuesto el interés de ustedes, ¿no? Que ha sido lo más importante. La Prepa Ibero también presente todos estos días. Los esperamos aquí el año que entra y cuando acaben, por supuesto, su carrera, su prepa, los esperamos aquí para su carrera. Y bueno, todos los colegas, profesores, profesoras, estudiantes, en general al personal de la universidad, muchas gracias y pues nos vemos en el próximo.
No. Bueno, como comentaba nuestro vicerrector, aún quedan algunas actividades. A las 2 de la tarde en este auditorio será el taller del doctor Edmond Awad y a las 4 y a las 6 habrá otros talleres. Para más información, allá afuera con los colegas. Gracias.
Muy bien. ¿Vamos a sacar ese whisky o qué te regalo?